Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Ruth Seiden-Spinner. I'm the Assistant Director of Curriculum Development and Training here at the Literacy Council, soon to be C2C. And today we have Andrea Echelberger as our presenter for our monthly virtual brown bag. She's going to talk to us about trauma-informed teaching practices, how trauma can affect students' ability to learn, and how we can create safe spaces for students to feel safe to learn and succeed in our classrooms. Andrea comes to us from Robbinsdale Adult Academic Program, and she has 18 years of experience in teaching and training instructors in adult ed. So, Andrea, we welcome you, and without further ado.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So today we'll be talking about trauma-informed teaching practices for adult learners. And I want to make clear at the start of this training that this is an area that I have a lot of personal interest in, having worked with adult learners for such a long time, and having seen learners that are obviously under a great deal of stress and trauma, and having learned other languages and felt that stress and worry about my abilities myself. However, while this is an area I have a lot of interest in, I've done research in, I am not an expert, so I will do my best to answer any questions that come up. But I do just want to make that clear. If you have questions, if people are able to put them in the chat, I'll do my best to answer them as we go. I have the chat open and I'll keep an eye on that. And then if I'm not able to answer a question during the session, we'll have some time for questions at the end. All right, here's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to answer some questions. The first question is, what's going on in there? And we'll talk about the impact of stress and trauma on the brain. The second question that we'll be looking at is, how do stress and trauma impact adult learning? And we'll end with, how can we create learning environments where everyone can thrive? So we are going to begin our session with doing a couple of activities that you can do with your students to help students who have experienced stress and trauma, and that are just good for all students. So regardless of whether or not they've are experiencing large deals of stress or have experienced trauma, it's good for everybody. So can everybody open your chat, please? And type in one thing you feel thankful for right now. And it can be very small. It doesn't have to be something big. Seeing a hot latte is fantastic. I'm seeing a lot of things about family, having extra time, being Friday, having good health coming up, being thankful for everyone who showed up today, family, health, warm house, absolutely. Parents, okay. Being able to be at home and participate or being able to be other places and participate rather than having to be in person. I just adopted 2 cats, so I am very thankful for my new cats. It's nice to have something to welcome you when you come home. All right, so we just did a quick gratitude practice. Now, as we begin, I'm going to have us do a grounding practice just for about 30 seconds, where we're going to do some breathing together. All right, so please inhale, hold for 4, and exhale through your mouth. Okay, we're going to do this about 5 times. All right, so I'm going to keep talking, but feel free to keep breathing along with, please keep breathing, but please feel free to keep breathing along with this graphic. The reason that we want to do this and the reason that we are doing this is it helps to regulate and calm down our nervous system, which makes us more open to learning. And doing some breathing exercises is something that you can absolutely do with your learners at the beginning of class or anytime during class to help people regulate that nervous system and be able to better learn what you are teaching. I also do want to say that we're going to be talking about stress. We're going to be talking about trauma. And these can be some hard topics. So if at any point you need to step away to take care of yourself, if you need to leave the session to take care of yourself, please feel free to do that. I don't want people to feel like they are stuck here if something that we are talking about feels traumatic or triggering. So please do feel free to take care of yourself any way that you need to. All right, let's get into our first question, which is what's going on in there, the impact of stress and trauma on the brain. So we're going to start with looking at some types of memory, because this is important for knowing exactly what we're dealing with when we talk about the impact that stress and trauma have on the brain and how it impacts our different types of memory. So the first type of memory we have is short-term memory. We can think of it as the brain's Post-it note. It holds a small amount of information, 7 items or less. And it's in an active, readily available state, 10 to 15 seconds or up to a minute. And of course, this is going to change from person to person. But when we talk about short-term memory, this is what you use when you are remembering a code to type in your computer to get into your bank account, when you're having a conversation with somebody and you're holding in your head what you're going to say when it's your turn to speak. If you're doing a math equation and you're remembering what you carry over, those would be examples of short-term memory. Then we have working memory. So working memory is the ability to hold and manipulate information over brief intervals. It allows us to work with information without losing track of what we're doing. And it is a gateway to long-term memory. Generally for people, working memory lasts about 20 minutes. And this is what people are using when they are in class and figuring things out, whether they are working on phonics, doing a reading, concentrating on math. They are using their working memory to rehearse and practice what they will put into their long-term memory. So working memory is sort of a rehearsal, an organization of what will go into the long-term memory. And then the final section we have, final type of memory, is long-term memory. And this is when we make a conscious effort to retain a short-term memory. And we can do this through repetition, which is why repetition is hands down the most valuable tool that teachers have in their toolbox when it comes to teaching language learners or any adult learners. Meaningful association. So when people learn something new that reminds them of something that they already know, of a long-term memory that they already have, and emotion. And does anybody have an idea which sticks more in our mind in long-term memory? Something that's associated with a positive emotion or a memory that's associated with a negative emotion? What do you think our long-term memory is more likely to store? Absolutely. Somebody typed in right away. Negative, negative, negative. Yes. Our brains remember negative memories a lot more than they remember positive memories. And, this makes sense when we're talking about survival. It's a lot more important to remember which berries are poisonous instead of which berries are delicious. It's going to help us, would help us in an evolutionary sense. However, at this point in our lives, it's really not serving us that well. So long-term memories are consolidated in the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is important to remember. We'll be talking about that later. And then are stored in neural connections throughout the brain. And when we're talking about things being stored in neural connections throughout the brain, and we're talking about the use of repetition for helping people learn things that are new. One of my favorite analogies comes from talking about and thinking about a pathway. So if you think about a school that has two buildings, and there's a sidewalk out front that connects the two buildings, and there's a green lawn in between, and it's a lot faster for students to walk across the green lawn than going on the sidewalk. What do you think people are going to do? Are they going to take the sidewalk, or are they going to take that shortcut across the green lawn? Absolutely. Students are probably going to take the shortcut. And when we're thinking about repetition and using that working memory, you know, some people might walk across the lawn and it takes, 10, 20, 30, 40 people before the grass is trampled down. And then gradually, as more people walk on it, it becomes a wider and wider and wider dirt track. And eventually the university gives up and paves over it. And that's essentially what's happening in our brain when we are using our working memory, when we're rehearsing and practicing things over and over through repetition, and transferring things through our hippocampus into those neural networks throughout the brain. So that really emphasizes the importance of repetition when it comes to learning new things. We also have two other types of memory. The procedural memory, which uses past experience to remember things without thinking about them. And this tends to be really important in language development because it allows a person to talk without thinking about the proper grammar or syntax. And this is when we talk about children are like sponges when it comes to language. That's because they're learning things through their procedural memory. They're not thinking about them, they're just picking them up. And that means that they tend to have a much better sense and be much more able to use that in the future and not have to think about it. They can just use it automatically. We also have declarative memory, and declarative memory is the memory of facts and events that can be consciously recalled. And adults who are learning a new language or are learning something new, whether it is learning things, math or English language arts as an adult, this is what their type of memory that they're using. They use the rules and vocabulary of a new memory using declarative language. So that's when the brain really has to work, and the working memory is incredibly important at that point. All right, now we're going to talk about the impact that stress and trauma have on the brain. So we have different types of stress responses. The first type of a stress response is called the positive stress response. And a positive stress response is what happens when you are faced with a stressful situation and your body kicks in some hormones, kicks up some cortisol to help you get through it or get out of it. So this, for example, would be if you are doing public speaking and you get that kind of burst of energy that pushes you through. If you are interviewing for a new job, if you are starting a new job, those would be positive stress responses. And you get that burst of hormones, the cortisol is released in your body, that fight, flight, or freeze instinct kicks in. However, once the stressful event is gone, your body immediately returns to normal. So the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and you're able to go back to a normal regulated nervous system. Then we have tolerable stress responses, and tolerable stress responses are longer and prolonged. So this could be a divorce, this could be a death in the family, This could be losing a job and then when you're searching for a new one. And tolerable stress responses are characterized by a greater number of hormones, more cortisol being released into the body. And the thing that makes it a tolerable stress response is that eventually the body will regulate. Eventually will adapt to the new situation, will start to relax, will start to not feel as stressed about it. And that's when the cortisol begins to leave the body. It's longer and more prolonged than the positive stress response, but we know that it will get better with time. But then we have the toxic stress response. And toxic stress response is very different from tolerable stress responses or positive stress responses. Toxic stress responses are when somebody is faced with stress day in and day out, and it does not alleviate. So that nervous system is continuously releasing the hormone cortisol. The cortisol is remaining in the body, and all of the nervous system is continuously activated. And the thing that we know is the human body is wired for short bursts of stress. That's what we are supposed to be ideally dealing with. Prolonged stress tends to impact people's ability to do math, to process language, concentrate, and leads to poor long and short-term memories and much poorer working memories. What they found is that people who are stressed don't generalize or adapt old pieces of information to new scenarios, as well as non-stressed people. And adults with higher levels of stress performed 50% worse than adults with low levels of stress on tests of declarative memory and executive function. And declarative memory is what we use to learn a new language or learn a new skill as an adult and when we are in school. All right, so I'm going to pause from talking for a moment, and I'm going to ask you to put something in the chat. And I'd like you to put into the chat, what are some of the stressors that students may experience in and outside of the program that you work with? Financial came through immediately, housing, fear of failure, COVID and deaths related to COVID, addiction and work, job loss, immigration, language barriers, family, domestic violence. Oh, issues in home country. Yeah, that can be huge. Work, health, fear of deportation, food insecurity. Yeah, there is a lot of things that people might experience stress about in or outside the classroom that we don't have a lot of control over. However, there are things we can do in the classroom, and we'll be talking about that later, to help students regulate, feel safe, and be better able to learn. All right, next we're going to talk about trauma and the brain. So let's begin with having a working definition of trauma. So trauma results from exposure to incidents or series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and or spiritual well-being. And I do want to emphasize that when we talk about lasting, it doesn't mean forever. People can heal from trauma. However, generally people need time, support, and some help to be able to do that. I also want to emphasize that trauma is something that is not just certain people experience trauma. Trauma doesn't discriminate. People of all races, ethnic backgrounds, classes, immigration statuses, ages, genders, sexual orientation, everybody can experience trauma. There isn't, unfortunately, anything to protect us from trauma. Also, people are going to experience trauma differently. So an event that feels extremely traumatic to one person might not be traumatic to another person who goes through the same experience. There's a lot of different factors that go into who experiences trauma and what is traumatizing. So just want to make that clear. We can't make blanket assumptions about what people will find to be traumatic. It's so varied, just depending on people and what their past experiences are and how their brains are wired. All right, and I see a question. If we can get a copy of the presentation, I can talk to Ruth about that to see if that's something that is possible. I'm happy to share. All right, so let's talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So when a stressful event happens, like we talked about before, the sympathetic nervous system activates that fight, flight, or freeze response, and that stress hormone cortisol is released. And normally when the stressor goes away, if it's, a tolerable stress response, the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and returns the body to its normal, regulated state. However, when we're talking about a traumatic event, there is unusually large amounts of stress, and that excess cortisol is released into the body. And with post-traumatic stress disorder, what happens is that when somebody is reminded of what their experience was, their brain has a flashback, and that huge amount of cortisol is re-released into the body. Also, trauma can cause stress, and so people can have that toxic stress response where the parasympathetic nervous system does not kick in, and people remain with those really high levels of cortisol. And that amount of cortisol being in the body can have negative effects on the brain. It can actually damage the CA3 neurons in the hippocampus. And when, for example, they did a study where they looked at the brains of veterans with PTSD, and they found that the hippocampus had actually shrunk by about 7%. Whew, which is really scary, because what the hippocampus does is consolidate and store those long-term memories. And as you can imagine, this can make learning a lot more difficult. The good news is, I do always want to share some good news, is that when they've done research on people who have experienced PTSD, people who are getting help for their PSD, who are starting to manage it and re-regulate their bodies, the hippocampus does return to its normal size. So it's something that doesn't have to be permanent. All right, so we're going to talk about how stress and trauma impact adult learning. We're going to start with looking at a continuum. So the hyperarousal continuum, and ideally when people walk into a classroom, they are at rest. Their hyperarousal is restful. However, that can quickly change to vigilance, which can change to resistance, defiance, up to aggression, depending on how much of a threat is perceived. The cognitive style, again, ideally would be at abstract, but then when a threat to safety is perceived, it shifts to concrete, up to emotional, to reactive, to reflexive. And the internal state, again, ideally, would be calm, shifting to arousal, to alarm, to fear, to terror. And when a threat to safety is perceived, a person with trauma or a history of educational failure or humiliation progresses through arousal continuum that literally changes what part of their brain is running the show. And so we mentioned the ideal. somebody comes in, they are, at rest, their cognitive style is abstract, they're able to take in new information, work with it, not be afraid of new information, and their internal state is calm. However, someone who's experiencing large amounts of stress or even small amounts of stress, but we're talking about kind of that toxic stress today, or who has experienced trauma or has had negative experiences in the past of learning, of being in school, is probably not going to come in that ideal state. They might be coming in vigilant, able to think in really concrete terms, and already aroused. And it could be more extreme than that. Somebody might be coming in feeling resistance to what they're learning, feeling really emotional, and feeling kind of afraid and alarmed. And of course, depending on what happens in the class, people can continue to progress through that continuum and have become more and more upset or frustrated. And of course, I want to say this isn't the fault of the teacher. This doesn't have anything to necessarily to do with this school or what people are experiencing in school. It can just be where people are aroused at that point. And knowing that there's been some really interesting research where they show faces that start with really neutral faces and then moving towards looking fearful or looking angry or looking disgusted. And people who have experienced trauma perceive that emotion much, much earlier than people who have not experienced trauma. So people who have experienced trauma are kind of hyper vigilant and always looking out for a threat. And they see threat where other people might not see a threat. So the impact of trauma and stress on learning, there's a few things that it does. It uses resources that need to be used for learning. So when we talk about that working memory, that you're supposed to be rehearsing and working with and manipulating new information in order to store it in long-term memory. Well, if that working memory is taken up with worrying about your family, wondering how you're going to pay your rent, thinking about experiences that have happened to you in the past, just feeling that general unease and stress, that is going to take up those resources that you should be using to focus on what you are in the process of learning, what is being taught. It also decreases attention and can shorten that working memory. And to learn something, you need to pay attention. Attention drives learning. Unfortunately, you can't learn things when you're not paying attention to it. It can also increase behaviors that are detrimental to learning. And when we're talking about working with adults, we generally don't mean people acting out. What this can mean is people coming in late or not coming to class at all, being on their phones, having side conversations that have nothing to do with what's being taught in their first language, getting up and leaving the room frequently for long periods of time, and not coming back, taking phone calls. All of those are things that can be detrimental to learning. And can also include, and I think this is really important to mention, an aversion to tasks and processes such as taking risks, starting a new task, responding to questions, or considering alternative viewpoints. And that's not because people aren't trying and don't want to learn. It's because it's really hard for them, and things that we think should be easy, like reading out loud in front of the class, feel scary and feel really threatening. All right, we are going to watch a short video, about a 5-minute video that I think does a really good job of unpacking a little bit more how trauma and stress impact people's ability to learn. So I want to say this video is made for teachers who are working with children, but it's incredibly irrelevant to the work that we do with adults. When they're talking about the things, stress and trauma in here and how people learn, I immediately recognize behaviors and emotions that I see in learners I work with. And of course, some behaviors and emotions that I've felt myself when I'm attempting to learn and are feeling really stressed. So I am going to play, and then we'll play it to the end and be thinking about, how does this apply to your students, to what you've seen? Have you seen any of these behaviors in your class? And then before we move on to this final section of the session, be thinking about how you would counteract it and how you would be kind to learners who are experiencing this.
Hey, welcome back. Today, I really wanted to think about what's the best way to teach teachers about trauma without getting them distracted with all the technical stuff, and what's the most important thing for them to understand and learn. And I thought that the best way to do it might be to just make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness, and it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes, and they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions and look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn stuff, and they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are. Now, it's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense, because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's harder to get out of that. And it's harder to really go into learning brain. And the way I think about it is kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again? Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock gets, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. Now, the kicker is that for traumatized people, stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's kind of like a baby elephant. You know how like on those nature shows, the baby elephant is like playing with leaves or exploring a tree or something like that and having a lot of fun. And the only reason why they can do that is because there's a whole group of mama elephants around that baby protecting it and looking out for danger. So a kid with trauma or who's stuck in survival brain, it's kind of like that baby elephant who doesn't have protective adults around them. They can't play and learn because they're way too focused looking out for threat and danger. So this is why I really believe that the most important thing that schools need to focus on, way more important than any kind of techniques or curricula, is really whether or not they are creating that environment where students feel like they're surrounded by these big mama elephants who are going to protect them and watch out for them and make them safe. And when students have that, I bet you it unlocks their curiosity, their eagerness to learn, and play as a way to learn. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Thanks.
All right, so I don't want to imply that our students are baby elephants, but I do think that that video is incredibly helpful with the image of learning brain and survival brain. And I'm curious to know if people have seen or experienced this when they are working with students, that students are hyper-focused on threat, afraid of ambiguity, students who might be stuck in survival brain. Is this something that rang true for you? You can go ahead and put your answer in the chat. Also feel free to put it down if you have experienced specific behaviors that you've seen students do that impact their learning. So people saying that they've seen it more in cases for adults and that kids notice it less. Student whose elderly parent is in the hospital displays these behaviors over the last couple weeks. Yeah, so it's something that can change depending on stress. All right. Being not engaged in the class, being overly apologetic, checking their phones a lot. Absolutely. And all of those are indications and can be indications of people being stuck in survival brain. So then students not being able to transfer information they've learned from one day in class to the next. Yes, that's huge. And that generally implies that the working memory has been impacted and the long-term memory has been impacted. Inability to focus and change in participation. Great, thank you, everybody. Yeah, it's something that we can often see. So, like I said, our students are not baby elephants, and teachers and administrators in schools are not mama elephants. However, there are things we can do in schools to make people feel safe and supported by the school, and so that they are better able to learn. So we're going to look through some different strategies and suggestions for helping make students and schools feel more safe. So starting with looking at strategies for using resources when students are focused on other things outside of the classroom, and decreasing hypervigilance, so being hyper-focused on threats. Some instructional practices that we can do is providing consistency and structure so people know what to expect when they walk into a classroom. And this is doing things like providing routines and letting learners know the changes ahead of time. So if there's going to be a change to the routine, making sure students are prepared for it. And one thing that I see in adult learning is on a testing day, or if there is a sub in schools, not telling students that that is happening ahead of time because they want to make sure that students attend, and they're afraid that they won't come if they think there's a test or know that there's going to be a sub. But that can actually be traumatic and can cause people to perform more poorly in class or on the test that day, because it makes them more vigilant because they feel alarm and their stress levels raise when that happens. Also, being really transparent about goals and expectations for class so that students aren't surprised when they hear something that's an expectation or figure out there's something they're supposed to be learning that they didn't know about. So that can be schedules, objectives, expectations around attendance and behaviors, being very clear and transparent about that from the beginning. Providing content warnings as needed and allowing students to opt out of those topics or opt out and walk out of class that day or walk out of a reading if they need to, but encouraging people to take care of themselves. We're working with adults. Adults generally have a better sense of what they need and what's going to be hard for them. And making sure people know that if something is hard, if it's feeling triggering or traumatizing or scary, they can get up and take care of themselves in any way that they need. And also being aware of what might trigger students is really important. And so spending some time focusing on that and thinking about that as teachers. Something else we can do is building in additional wait time. So when we ask for a volunteer, when we ask learners questions, when we have want somebody to come up to the board and demonstrate the problem or write a vocabulary word, making sure that you're giving students a time to think about it, time to organize their thoughts, time to activate that working memory and figure out what exactly they're going to be doing. If we're always going so quickly and jumping in, immediately calling on people and having them come up to the board with no warning, that can be really, really scary and can activate stress and can cause that hypervigilance to kick in. So making sure you're just building in additional wait time after you ask somebody to come up, say, I'll give you a minute or two to think about it. When you ask a question to the class, pausing, letting people think without immediately jumping in. When students know that this is going to happen, they tend to relax because they know they'll have time to think. So those are 3 instructional practice recommendations for helping students not use resources that are just thinking about something else and decreasing that hypervigilance and that constant focus on scanning for threats. We also have some strategies for attention and memory. So helping students to pay attention, because attention drives learning. Can't learn something that you don't pay attention to. And helping students with that memory and transferring those short-term memories into long-term memories. So a big one is using images. There was a fascinating study that was done with 2 groups of university students where they had students listen to the same 30-minute pre-recorded lecture. And one group just listened to the audio and another group listened to the audio with images accompanying it. And when they tested their memory, their recall, 72 hours later, the students who had just listened to the lecture had on average a recall of about 10%, while the students who had listened to the same lecture with images had a recall of around 65%. So images really help the brain store new information. We also want to watch our teacher talk and avoid lengthy statements and questions. Make sure that we're not spending too much time talking, we're keeping it short and allowing pauses and for students to process information and giving students lots of opportunities to participate. We can also spend a little time explaining the rationale behind tasks or assignments. This is why I'm asking you to do this. This is what skill you're going to be practicing. This is what you'll be learning. We also want to provide opportunities for success through calling on students occasionally with questions we know that they can answer, doing review, playing games where students are working together and are going to experience the success, And this is really important because our brains love that feeling, love that dopamine that they get when they accomplish something, when they feel successful. So providing opportunities for that in the classroom are really important. We also want to make sure that we're building in a lot of reminders for assignments, routine changes, and expectations to help support memory of learners, and providing rubrics or checklists for assignments. So again, supporting people's memory. All right, and the final thing I'm going to talk about is strategies for behavior. And people in the chat mentioned a lot of behaviors that they see in class. So something that we can do is give learners some control and choice within reason in the classroom. So not saying that you go into the classroom and say, okay, everybody, what do you want to learn today? But it might be things such as, we're going to be doing, working on this topic. Maybe we're going to be working on phonics. Do you want to do this activity or this activity first? Perhaps having stations where students can choose where they want to go, what they want to work on, and what order they want to work on things. So giving students some control, some choice really helps students feel more ownership, and that can cause students to have better behaviors. Something else that we can do is build in movement and brain breaks. So giving people a chance to get out of their head and into their body. And also, there hits a point where people have been sitting for so long, and knowing that that working memory is about 20 minutes, people need a chance to stop and reset their brain. They need the neurotransmitters in their brain to have a chance to replenish themselves. Otherwise, learning can, for many people, stop happening. So building in movement, and that could be simple things like stopping and stretching, moving to a new table to find a new partner, and brain breaks can be similar things. Or you might have students do something like do some intentional movement, do a 5-minute yoga video, do one of the brain, there's a lot, if you just look online and Google brain breaks for classrooms, you will find thousands and thousands of ideas of what you can do. Also, encouraging laughter and making sure that people, when people are able to laugh, it's an indication that they feel safe. So having opportunities for students to laugh, to relax, to use some humor. Using positive words to prime. So if somebody is under a great deal of stress and we say, don't worry, what's the word that they're going to focus on? They're going to focus on the word worry. So making sure that we're being careful about what words that we're using. And this can also be true when we are moving around the class and giving support. Instead of saying you have 3 mistakes, or I see 2 things that are wrong, saying, oh, I see 3 ways that you can make this better. Here are a couple changes you can make that will improve your writing. Also knowing that easy is a 4-letter word. If we say something is easy and then a student finds it difficult, that is really going to impact how they feel about their abilities, and that can really impact their behavior. People tend to check out when they think that they're not going to be good at something. And one of the fastest ways to do that is to tell them something will be easy and then have students find that it's challenging. And we also want to avoid looming and or hovering over and around learners. So leaning over students' shoulders is something that can be really alarming for people who have experienced trauma. Instead, pulling up a chair, sitting down, and looking at someone face to face. And I'm going to quickly talk about some strategies for the teacher, because working with adult learners, it's one of the most rewarding jobs I can imagine. It can also have some challenging impacts on the teacher. So some things we can do, and if you are interested in continuing to develop your trauma-informed responses for the classroom, is keep learning and just know that it takes the time to develop a trauma-informed lens. It's not going to happen overnight or after an hour webinar. Create a plan on how to respond if a student is triggered. People generally feel a lot safer and more confident when there is a plan in place for what will I do if somebody needs help in my classroom. Commit to becoming a culturally responsive teacher and develop awareness of implicit bias. Are there ways that you are acting in class, expectations that you have that might be traumatizing to learners or causing students to remember educational trauma they've experienced in the past? We want to avoid labeling learners based on behaviors and past experiences. And I think this is really important. Remember, it's not about you. Someone who has experienced trauma or is experiencing toxic stress and might be acting out or not learning really well or refusing to participate, keeping in mind that it's not because of anything that you are doing as a teacher. It's because of things that are out of your control and what the learner is experiencing outside of class. Also knowing that it's okay to be not okay. If you have an experience in a classroom, you're having a long day, things just feel like they're dragging. You don't have to feel like everything is positive all the time. It's okay to be frustrated, and please tap into your support networks to get through it. And finally, recognize what you can and can't control. Focus on what you can influence instead. You can't control a student's stress. You can't control whether or not they have childcare issues that mean that they can't come to school for a week at a time. But what you can control is how you respond to them and the type of greeting that they get when they walk in the door. So there's so much stuff that's out of our control that can feel overwhelming, but remembering that there are things that are within our control, and that's what we want to focus on and think about. All right, final question for you. And you can put this in the chat. Are there current strategies that we talked about that your program uses to support learning? Or is there anything else that you would like to see your programs do? And this can also be yourself as a teacher. So I'm pausing to let people put things in the chat. So I'm seeing offering low-cost immigration services, establishing routines. Yeah, that's huge. Mention your teacher meetings. So when, I'm assuming that's when you'll be outside of the class. Anything else that people are doing or would like to do? Find myself needing to allow pauses and more time to process responses. Yeah, I love this. Allowing more time and being okay with silence. I'm seeing there is a case manager available to help students. Posting a list of things that are related for problem solving. Oh, this is great. Community College recently opened up free counseling sessions for non-credit students. Telling the students about tests and changes in routines. That's great. Providing open forums for students to discuss their issues in and outside the classroom. Short sentences and wait time, laughter and safe community environment. And then I see somebody's interested in giving more choices. Oh, all right. And thank you. Reference that referring to teacher meetings to collaborate among staff and build awareness. And I see, I'm going to read this one last one, incorporation of student choice in establishing routines and liking to increase wait time and continue to build opportunities for success. All right, thank you to everyone who responded. It sounds like there's a lot of great things that are already happening, and people have some ideas for what they would like to implement. So as we're wrapping up and before we go to questions, just want to make 3 book recommendations, and the links of these are live and will be available in the slides. The Body Keeps the Score is a deep dive into trauma in the brain. It's fascinating, but it is a really deep dive. My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Healing Our Hearts, Mending Our Hearts and Our Brains, is actually by somebody local in Minneapolis, where I'm presenting from today. And then Culturally Responsive Trauma in the Brain is just an excellent book that talks about things that teachers can do in classes, and how it interacts with that, what teachers do interacts with the brain, and talks a lot about what might be what's happening in the brain when students are struggling in the classroom. I see somebody has read these books. Yes, they're fantastic. I've been in 2 book clubs already about the culturally responsive teaching and the brain. And it looks like we have a few minutes for questions. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and let me know. We have just a few minutes, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Does anyone have any questions for Andrea? Oh, you covered so much helpful information, Andrea. This is super, super informative.
Okay, so I see suggestions for best practices for responding to students who are triggered both in person and perhaps online. I think for in person, the best thing to do is remove students from the situation that triggered them. So get them out of the classroom into a space that feels safe. And so that means a space that is familiar to them, as opposed to pulling them into a brand new room. Letting them calm themselves, being present and allowing students to talk if they want, not leaving them alone unless they ask for it, but also not asking questions or forcing students to talk, just being a calming presence. Online is a lot more challenging, of course, because you're not in person. But I believe that encouraging students to step away and take care of themselves if they need it is really helpful, because then the students aren't staying online and staying in a situation that is difficult and traumatizing to them. So encouraging students to make those decisions and take care of themselves. Okay, I'm seeing, does the learning modalities also play a role in adult learners and how they perceive learning? I would say absolutely. That if people are more comfortable learning in different ways, if they're more comfortable learning through listening information, through seeing information, through the hands-on manipulation, kinesthetic learning, being able to learn in the way that is the most comfortable for them is really going to impact that affective filter. So that's why it's so important in the classroom to, not learn 10 different things, but one thing in 10 different ways, to make sure that students are able to learn in the learning modality that feels the safest and the most comfortable for them. So they absolutely are connected. Oh, tricky one. Suggestion to help a student who attends a discussion group and has distractions in their home, like children or others in the home. I think that's the $1 million question. It's so hard because you want people to be there and be fully present, but you have to respect the fact, we have to respect the fact that people have other things going on in their lives. So I think going back to the encouraging people to step away if they need to, and then come back when they can be focused. Not respecting the fact that they do have other things happening. So not continuously throwing questions at them, because that can be really alarming if people don't feel prepared. And we want people to be coming back. And what else would I say? I'm trying to think of what I do when that happens, because I definitely have that happening when I'm teaching my evening class online. So one thing I do is I just very kindly say, or as kindly as I can, oh, I can hear that you have some things going on. I'm going to mute you right now. And when you're ready, just go ahead and unmute yourself and come back. So keeping an eye on it, because we don't want it to start distracting other students, but being really kind of kind and matter of fact about, of course, this is what is happening. It's just fine. Rejoin whenever you're ready. I don't know if that was helpful, but that's what I do. And I think that's that, remembering what we can and can't control, because we can't control if students need to give childcare or be caring for someone.
I just wanted to hop on real quick and say that Denise has a quick announcement that she wants to make. So if you have other questions, keep them coming in the chat. But we're going to have Denise pop on and tell us about an event that's coming up. And while she's getting audio permission, I want to say thank you again to you, Andrea, for this fantastic presentation. Just from all the participation from the attendees and the questions that are coming through now, it's obvious that it was super helpful for everyone, super informative. And there's Denise.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to take a moment to make sure everyone knew about our upcoming community fair. You're invited. We would love for you to invite your learners as well. And it is an opportunity for them to connect to various resources that the community has to offer. I know we as an org, we don't have the capacity to have in-house counselors and in-house, this and that, and partnerships among the community are hugely important. And to get as many partners in one space as possible, where learners can speak to them face-to-face about immigration concerns, about workforce concerns, how to get their basic needs met, like clothing and food and housing, is super important. So April 22nd, if you could mark that on your calendar and join us between 1 and 5 p.m. at the Wheaton Library and Rec Center in Silver Spring, Maryland. We'll be on the top floor. If you have new students that are interested in joining or participating in some of our services, we'll have testing and registration for various things on site. And it's completely and totally free. So we're hoping that you'll pass this information on to your learners and that you yourself will mark it in your calendars and join us. Again, it's completely free and it allows learners to have access to community resources and talk to people right there. As you see, you can find more information on our website, learnwithc2c.org. And if you have specific questions, Zoe at learnwithc2c.org is who you can reach out to for that information. Thank you.
So in addition to all of the ways that Andrea has shared with us that we can help our students to meet their needs and decrease the stress and trauma in their lives, here's another way that you can help your students by sharing this community fair invitation with them and encouraging them to go. They can get all kinds of support and resources that will hopefully help them to reduce some of the stress in their lives. And again, thank you so much, Andrea. I don't see another question in there, so I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Everyone, thank you for coming. It's been a super presentation, and I appreciate all of the feedback and the questions and participation. That's it. Oh, I almost forgot. Next month on Friday, April 14th, we have a virtual brown bag on cultural awareness as educators. So please plan to join us for that. We'll be posting invitations soon. That is next month's virtual brown bag, Friday the 14th from noon to 1, same platform on becoming more culturally aware as educators. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody. It was great to be here.